Kia ora and welcome to the Rainbow Umbrella, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything under the rainbow. And today I'm super excited to be talking about books with a friend of the pod and friend of the host, Paula. Hi Paula, thank you so much for being here.
Hi Mel, thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime, any excuse to talk about books, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I've been excited about this one for a while, so it's good that we finally get to do it.
Yes, I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. Right, so let's kick it off. You and I are both, avid readers, love anything written down. What popular reading trends have you noticed in the last few years? Like what new trends have you noticed?
I think for me as an avid user of TikTok, a serial user of TikTok.
This is a safe space.
Yes. I think there's a real increase in people feeling comfortable with what they're reading. I think for me, I've grown up reading a lot of fantasy books and it's always been something that I've enjoyed, but I think there's always been an aspect of it's not good enough. I think like there's shame around what you're reading, the classics and things. I've never been a classic reader. So having access to a social media space like TikTok, you've got access to people all over the world, and feeling less ashamed, I should say, to read what you want and be open about what you want. People are open now to reading simply just what they enjoy, which is really nice to see. There's no sort of expectation of a certain genre that you must be reading, which is really nice to see.
So you're thinking it's more a trend in like acceptance of whatever it is you want to read rather than, this genre might be becoming more popular or this genre is becoming less popular because, let's open the can of worms. Fairy porn, right?
Fairy porn.
That's a big thing that's come up recently, like in the last few years.
Yeah.
And I find it fascinating that, a lot of the material is targeted towards people that might be slightly younger than us. But, I've spoken to so many people, all ages, that are reading this sort of thing and that's it's boomed, right?
Yeah.
How do you find it in the TikTok space when people talk about that?
I think it's nice to feel like you're part of a community. I think it's something that's always been there, and the likes of TikTok and other social media platforms gives people a space to be open about it. I've always read a lot of fantasy. I know there's a lot of people that have read a lot of romance, and to see that combined and see it combine in a space where people can talk about it openly if they don't have friends that read a lot of it. You can go online and you can engage in a conversation with people about something that you love so much. And I think that in turn encourages people to read more of that as well. So it's just people reading different genres. It's always been there, but now social media particularly is giving a space for people to be more open about it. So I think that it's something it's been there all along. It just perhaps hasn't been as in the public eye.
Okay, so there's, by the sounds of it, a huge benefit to the TikTok space. As someone who has other people do my TikToking for me, thanks Paula.
You're welcome.
It's not a platform I engage in, and like anything social media, there's obviously positives and negatives, but what I'm hearing from you is in the reading space, it's actually a really positive thing. It's, you've got a safe space, a safe community, and you're also getting your eyes open to other genres and other styles and types of reading that you might not have encountered before.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's giving, potential authors a space as well. I follow a couple of people on TikTok that have, released I think they've both released the second book now in their debut series, and it gives them an audience. They can connect with people, they can talk about their books they've done. ARC copies have been sent out to their followers on social media before the books have actually been published. That's potentially a market that wouldn't have existed before. Those books possibly wouldn't even have been written had they not had that support from people from all over the world, essentially. I think self-publishing books is hugely on the rise, and it's a fantastic thing to see that it's not a criteria that you have to meet of of publishers getting into established publishing companies. It's something you can do yourself, you can build a following, and I think people aren't afraid to make mistakes as much. They're not afraid to be corrected in what they do. So it's just a really welcoming environment to be in.
That's beautiful. I mean, one of the things I wanted to explore was, what these changing trends said about society as a whole, but I think you've kind of just summed it up there. Like, say what you want about TikTok and other forms of social media, but if it's creating this safe space for people, it's creating a community, it's giving creative people a platform, then that's pretty great.
It is, yeah. I mean, I've come across a lot of books that I probably wouldn't have ever found before, simply by people posting online and sharing their recommendations. The book talk world, as they call it, is a wonderful thing to be part of. And it also encourages people in different creative aspects as well. You've got people talking about the books, and then that expands into people acting out scenes from the books, cosplaying. They have the Starfall Ball, which was actually recently held in London, and sadly I did not go to it. And they had people cosplaying as the main characters of the ACOTAR series, and they had people dressed up, meeting. A lot of people felt comfortable enough to go by themselves and just make friends. And if it wasn't for Book Talk, if it wasn't for ACOTAR, the fairy porn, that sort of thing might not be happening.
And if you think about all the layers to that, like you mentioned meeting friends, but you've got people cosplaying, so that's a creative outlet there. People who might not be able to sew might have engaged their friends or, other professionals to assist them with that costume. So there's so many layers to this, which is just awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Add it to the calendar for next year.
Oh, yes, definitely. I'm not missing out again.
Amazing. So reading trends by nature of their popularity may shed light or, highlight behaviours that aren't necessarily behaviours that we would encourage. So I'm thinking 50 Shades here. We're not going to deep dive into 50 Shades.
There's
but
not enough time in the world for that.
There's not enough. But also, I mean, that blew up when it was first released. And, there are so many problems that we could unpick from 50 Shades, but also you mentioned ACOTAR. So there's some characters in ACOTAR that, maybe we're not such fans of, looking at you, Tamlin. But Tamlin, for example, his behaviour is portrayed as romantic, but I would strongly argue that it's anything but romantic. It's controlling, it's manipulative, it's, we haven't got all day to unpick Tamlin. So what do you think about, popular books highlighting aspects of behaviour that aren't so great?
I mean, it's something that happens in real life. And reading is a form of escapism, but it's also important to be able to highlight these real life issues. And particularly in the ACOTAR series, you see Tamlin's behaviour and you see the victim of that behaviour escape and find a better life for herself. I think that is a beautiful thing. Now, this might be a controversial opinion, but I'm interested in a bit more backstory on Tamlin, because I think the other aspect of what happens in real life is people have their own complex personalities, behaviours, and while none of that behaviour is justifiable, it's interesting to me, at least, to see how that came about. I would like to see more of his, or read more of his backstory and find out how he got to that point where he felt that behaviour was acceptable. And I think that's what happens in real life. And it's not about glorifying his behaviour, but rather understanding it, coming to a point of perhaps empathy and hoping that someone like him can be a better person down the line. And I think that applies to a lot of people in real life as well, hoping that they can learn from their mistakes.
I think that's beautiful, and I think that kind of ties into what we were just talking about in terms of the changing trends. It's like yes, they're fantasy series, yes, they're talking about magic and fairies and all of these things, but they're highlighting behaviours and personality traits that real people have, actions that real people will undertake. So it's really nice that you're able to say, well, actually, he was a bit of a dick, but here might be why, or I'm interested in to know what led to his actions and the way he behaved.
People do think that fantasy series are simply just fantasy series. There's a bit of smut involved and it's just simply enjoyed. But there are a lot of real life issues that come through. You look at the Throne of Glass series and even Akatar as well. You're dealing with mental health issues, disabilities, different races. Like it's just, there's a lot more involved than just the surface level, oh, it's fairy porn.
Yeah.
And I think that's the great thing about it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point to highlight. It's, you know, for those that haven't read it or don't know enough about it, it's so easy to label books like that fairy porn. But as you said, they deal with complex issues within the story. So it's not just a little bit of smut and a little bit of romance, you know. So do you think the ick that you get from reading characters such as Tamlin is enough to not like internalise and romanticise the behaviour? I mean, I know everyone is going to respond to that sort of thing in a different way. But, you know, we've had conversations about this before, the ick with Tamlin. Like, for someone who might not feel that, do you think that the way we feel is enough to not romanticise it, whereas someone might not feel that way? I hope that makes sense.
For me, I can read it and I can see his behaviours and I think that is just the worst thing and there is no way in hell that I'm letting that happen to me. But then, you know, you're very aware in real life that when you're in that situation, people do find it harder to let, you know, it's harder to get that outside perspective and I guess remove yourself from the situation. So I think it's, you know, it's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, there's no way I'd let myself go through that. But then real life is a different scenario and people do interpret things differently. There are probably people that read it. And I mean, I look at his behaviour and say it's not acceptable and I want to understand why. But I don't know that I would go as far to say understanding why makes his behaviour okay. Then other people would probably view that differently and think, oh, you know, he didn't mean that is probably an easy thing for some people to say. But yeah, it's certainly not for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it goes back to understanding, right? Even fairy porn characters need therapy, right?
Everyone needs therapy.
Therapy is for everyone. So now I want to touch on, because as we both do, reading young adult novels as a grown adult. Because you mentioned at the start, you know, there's that element of shame that could be attached to reading what is classed as fairy porn or like even fantasy books in general as an adult. But I don't think there should be any shame attached to it at all, because similar to the books we've just been talking about, so many young adult novels deal with complex themes, emotions, situations, like the whole spectrum of anything that could happen in your life. And it's not necessarily something we had growing up, because we might not have been able to talk to our peers or to our family about these sort of things. But if you're a teenager reading a book about someone who's dealing with the same sort of things as you, that's almost like reading therapy, right?
Yeah, I think so. Being able to read about something, I mean, I know I understand things better if I'm able to read it. So, you know, you could talk to someone about what you're going through, but being able to read it, take your time with it to understand it, I feel like for me at least that would sink in a lot more. So having those, it makes it seem like for someone like me being, 31 now, reading YA books, and there is that shame like, oh, I shouldn't be wasting my time with this. I'm too old for this. But I think there are themes that are applicable to anybody at any age. And I mean, it's not fantasy, but the Summer I Turned Pretty series, I watched that when that came out on Amazon Prime and I thought I'm going to give the books a go. And I read it. And while it's not something that current version of me really related to, I could look at it as something that the younger version of me would have really related to. And I think that's still important because, you know, going back to therapy being books, it can be quite healing as well for that little version of me who would have really enjoyed it. So I think there's definitely an aspect to books, of, you know, young adult books that are still going to be applicable to people at any age.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like I said, the subject matter of some of these books, they're often dealing with some quite heavy and significant things. I mean, whether it's just books alone or books that have been made into TV series or then TV series that have been adapted into book, whichever direction it goes, you think the likes of The Summer I Turned Pretty, you think the likes of any of the Rainbow Rowell books, dealing with queer themes and mental health, medical issues, all of that sort of thing. You think of 13 Reasons Why. So many of these things, it's real to a point, like it's dealing with stuff that is difficult and it's dealing with stuff that is heavy, but it's doing it especially with a book, it's doing it in a safe space so you can kind of read and take in or take from it what you can in a space that you're content, you're comfortable, and you're doing it in your own time.
And I think as well, being able to do it in an isolated situation. So you'd think, there are adults dealing with all of these themes, and they're having to deal with adult things as well. Mm-hmm. So you're struggling with depression, mm-hmm. but you're also dealing with things like a job and paying a mortgage and kids. I think young adult books have that beauty of it where the mental health aspect or any aspect could be or is isolated, I guess, because they're younger. The characters are younger. They're not dealing with the rest of the real life stuff as well. So it gives almost like a unique way of looking at it because you can isolate that specific issue and it gives you that space that you can enter and deal with that on its own, forgetting about the rest of your real life issues that you are working through.
Books are therapy, guys. Books are therapy.
Buy all the books.
Yeah. So in a similar sort of way is that dealing with, mental health, sexuality, gender identity, all of those issues that, are becoming more prevalent, particularly in the young adult books. What do you think about applying that lens to the reading of Smart? Because for some people that could be a way to, and again, in a safe space, in an isolated and controlled environment, explore aspects of their own sexuality and what they might find enjoyable or what they might not, without actually getting into it physically first. They kind of think, if I can read about this and it's enjoyable, maybe this is something I might want to explore in the real world, or maybe not. And I think that's quite beneficial for young adults because, the level of sex education can only go so far in high school. So what do you think? I
think it's a vital part of exploring that side of yourself. You do, like you said, you get this opportunity to explore it in an isolated environment, and it is a safe space.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, good writing will be educational but not detract from the story, right? Like if whatever it is they're talking about, whether it's, a sexual encounter, whether it's, a mental health issue, a gender identity issue, anything that's being talked about, if it's written well and in a considerate manner, it's not going to detract from the enjoyment of the story. If anything, it's going to add to it, right? Because, I can relate to this, or, I'm interested in this, I want to find out more, or no, I don't enjoy this,
Yes, I think the way that it's handled is the most important thing here. The consideration, the research that goes into it. If we want to go back to 50 Shades, I think that was part of the concern when that series was so popular because the BDSM aspect was apparently handled so poorly. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I couldn't get past the terrible writing of, the first few chapters of the book. I did enjoy the movies, but the books I just couldn't read. But I have, read things online that have said that it was handled poorly, and that encourages dangerous behaviour in the real life because it does, popular books like that, they do affect real life. They do have an impact on it, and it is scary to think that it could be handled in an incorrect way. So I think if things are talked about considerately, it gives people a space to really explore that. And I think if a character is written well and you can relate to them, you can see a bit of yourself in them, it's like having a friend that you can talk to and work things through. So I think that is really important, provided it is done well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's key, and you've hit the nail on the head there talking about the research because, 50 Shades was dangerous for so many reasons, as you've kind of touched upon, and it was clear that, bad writing aside, there wasn't really a huge amount of research that went into that. I mean, it was Twilight fan fiction.
Yeah,
it was never
real.
it was never going to be great, so that just highlights how important it is. If you're going to be talking about something significant like that, then you need to make sure that you are doing this in a responsible and considerate way, because what you are writing and what you are putting out to the world, aside from it being, something you've created, you are impacting the lives of those that pick it up one way or another, whether it's, oh, this is trash and they don't even read it, or whether they're like, hey, this sounds like fun, I want to explore this, but not doing it in a safe and consensual way. You've got to be careful.
You do.
Yes.
Yep.
And I mean, I think exploring these sort of things, a lot of it is coming through in the young adult books, but it's just as important for adults as well, particularly people of our generation, because this was not talked about when we were younger.
Oh,
we wouldn't have had
God,
the
no.
opportunity to have this kōrero 20 years ago, So it's just as important. Again, books as therapy, books as exploration, books as healing for anyone who wants to read them, right?
Yeah.
YA is not just for YAs.
It is not.
Another aspect that I wanted to explore is kind of separating the fantasy from reality in terms of that sort of thing. And it comes back to responsible writing as well. Like, I'm going back to Akatar because I know that we've both read it a lot and recently. And, we know the story quite well. Like, for me, what I found most challenging about those books is when there was some sort of sexual encounter, the way it was described, I'm like, this doesn't seem physically possible.
I think we know who we're referring to there.
Yeah, but do you know what I mean? Like, that, to me, it's like, I'm aware that there's fantasy, that this is a fantasy story, but there has to be some sort of element of responsibility in terms of, like, factual depiction of stuff, right? Even,
Yes.
I don't know. What do you think?
The way the wingspans are described, I think it's hugely unrealistic.
Yeah.
And I guess there's two sides to it. There's the part where you can read the sex scenes and you can think, hey, there's enthusiastic consent here. There's respect. I think for me, one of the biggest appeals to it is not just simply, oh, it's a sex scene, but it's well written. There's mutual respect, and that respect expands the whole way through the book in the not so sexual scenes as well. And so that's part of the appeal there. But then I guess there is the unrealistic side of the enjoyment that comes from books, and it is things like wingspan.
Yeah. If you know, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just find it very, very interesting that, again, it is a fantasy book, but it's like there's only so much suspension of reality that you can
Yes.
that you can have, right? Another aspect of it that I found interesting that I wanted to explore was repetition. So, particularly the Akatar series and the Crescent City series, there is a lot of sex in those.
Yes.
A lot of graphic depictions of sex. And, like, I've read books that have more graphic, but this is probably, like, more frequent. So do you find that the repetition of it kind of took you out of it? You got to the point where you're like, oh, okay, they're at it again and they're describing it. It's like, I know what you're going to do. Like, I felt like I could skip a few of them.
Interestingly, I have a friend who thinks that. Do it once, it's done.
Yeah.
Get on with it. But I think for me, it comes down to whether the scene is furthering the plot. If it's sex for the sake of sex, then no. But if it has a place in the storyline, if it's furthering that emotional bond between the characters, then I'm all for it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I mean, as much as I would love to sit here and talk about smutty books with you all day, that might be a wonderful place to wrap it up. But before we finish, I'm going to ask you possibly the hardest question. Do you have a favourite young adult book?
There's the young adult book that I read as a young adult, and that is the Mortal Instruments series, City of Bones, the Shadowhunter series. I mean, it's still going, and I've been reading it since I was probably 13 or 14. That will always have a top spot in my heart. If you want to go more into the young adult stuff that I read as an adult, then Akatar is definitely number one, because it is classed as YA, despite all of the smutty scenes.
Yes.
But yes, I mean, even if you're comparing it to Throne of Glass or Crescent City, Sarah J. Maas's other works, there's something about the family aspect of Akatar that I can't pass it up. It's the best.
Smart aside, it's pretty wholesome.
And it's very wholesome.
There you go. Smart can be healing and wholesome as well. Wonderful. I will grab some young A book recommendations off you and put in the show notes after this. But
I've got plenty.
Excellent. It has been a pleasure and an honour speaking with you. Thank you so much for being here all the way from London town.
Oh, anytime. Thank you for having me. I've loved it.
Excellent. Thanks, Paula.